To the Forward Miami Show. I'm your host, Damian Pardo, and Forward Miami is a local nonprofit that works on diversity and inclusion, and we produce the Gay Ocho Festival in Little Havana. Today, we have the great pleasure of talking to another author from the Miami Book Fair who will be with us. His name is Ernesto Mestre-Reed, and he joins us now to talk about his book, Sacrificio. And Ernesto, welcome to the show. I wanted you to talk a little bit about your background, kind of how you got here, and maybe we could open up that way and then talk a little bit about when you're going to do this presentation for the book fair toward the end.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I am Cubano. I was born in Cubano, Guajiro. I was born in Guantanamo in 1964, a long time ago. And my family emigrated to Spain in 1972. And we spent like 6 months there. And then we went to Miami. And after that, I went to school in New Orleans. And I came to New York to start writing. But the 3 novels I have written so far have all been set mostly in Cuba. So ever since I left, part of that obsession has been trying to figure out where it came from and the damage that the revolution did to families and separations. And because I grew up with that around my grandmothers, my aunts, everyone.
I'm intrigued by that because obviously so many people, including myself here in Miami, feel the same way. They feel some level of trauma. It doesn't matter how it generated, whether it's parents, yourself, or within your family.
I think it's a generational trauma that you feel afterwards to some extent. Because I remember when we left, it was like an adventure when you're 8 years old and you're getting on a plane. I remember one of the guards that's standing at the airplane just looked at us and goes, "Van a comer jamón de Franco, eh?" So we would, they were harassing us, but we didn't care. We were kids. We were having an adventure. But the trauma that you build up from the parents and from having, I have 2 kids, and I can't imagine having to leave the country with them and learn another language and all the sacrifices that my parents made.
When did you start figuring out that there was trauma?
When you start getting, in Miami in the 70s and 80s, there was still a lot of, racism and bigotry against Cubans. And, when you start getting called names and then you start figuring out that there's some tension here and then where we came from. And then you start hearing the stories of your family. One of my uncles got shot trying to sneak into the naval base in Guantanamo and killed. And I remember my grandmother telling me where he was shot. So you sort of start remembering the trauma.
Yeah, no, especially losing a family member like that. And many were political prisoners. There's a long list of those kinds.
Right. Then I started reading Arenas and all the and Padilla and all the writers, and so I started figuring it out, for myself through literature.
Mm-hmm. And so when you started thinking about this book, I mean, I know that the book touches a little bit about los inyectados or the injected ones, which I think were the frikis, no, or something like that.
Yeah, the frikis in Havana in the 90s, yeah.
Yeah, and so how did you start coming up with this, with Sacrificio?
An article, and this has been sort of brewing for over 20 years. There was an article published in the 90s in the New York Times Magazine about one of the frikis, and it was done in a very sort of romantic New York Times way, with there was even a picture of one like San Sebastian sitting over a waterfall. But it fascinated me that these kids were engaging in a kind of social revolution by basically condemning themselves to death at that point. Because in the early 90s, if you had HIV, you were pretty much condemned to death. And so I started investigating. I started talking to people who lived in Havana in the 90s and talking about, the circumstances during the special period, and really got into it for a long time and did a lot of research before, because I've never lived in Havana. So I had to do a lot of research about the city, about that special time. And decided to make it more political, because I'm really interested in how effective the revolutionary government has been at suppressing any kind of insurgents. And it's been cruel, and people here, I don't think, understand it. They think, I'm a very liberal Democrat, but I don't accept autocracies. That there's nothing that can defend that anywhere.
And I think sorry to interrupt, but I think you're making a great point, because for example, people didn't know generally that in Cuba you were tested forcibly, and if you were positive, you were sent to,
to a
you know,
sanitarium. And
to
then
sanitarium.
even after the reading the novel, but I've read that now in Cuba, because of those sanitariums, there's a special strain of HIV that's like nowhere in the world, because men who were in those sanitariums sort of, had sex with each other and stuff, and that a new strain sort of developed. So everything you do, with that kind of oppression, sort of has its own consequences.
Yeah, and that's pretty much the period that this book is set in, Sacrificio, correct?
In the 1990s, yeah, and
In the 1990s.
right before, and then I do remember, because we're Cuban, so we're very Catholic, so I do remember the huge deal that was made about the Pope going to Cuba in 1998. So I decided that had to be sort of part of it, and Castro won that battle, because even the picture, I remember seeing the picture of him and the Pope in the same
100%.
and they're the same age, and Castro looked like his son, so it was unbelievable the way he sort of won that battle in the political world. But like I say, like, I've had a lot of like Marxist professors that I've worked with, and I go, you know what? If the situation in Cuba was like that in a dog pound, you wouldn't accept it, but you accept it sort of when you go back to Cuba.
Yeah, it's actually incredible to some degree that it's accepted and romanticized.
Romanticized is the word, yeah.
Kind of by the left in this country. It's kind of like this free education, free healthcare.
I'm as leftist as you get. And go, yeah, there was free education, free healthcare, but you can't get a job, you can't vote, you can't congregate. So there's there has to be sort of an understanding of a kind of true history of it.
Yeah, and I think it's also striking that the new movement in July 11 that started a couple years back really was the left in Cuba. I mean, it really was the youth, the Black Cubans, the artists, and yet there's no bridge with this country. The left in this country does not amplify those.
I trolled AOC on on Twitter. I go, "You're going to say something about this?" And she finally did. To her credit, she finally said, like, "Yeah."
That's excellent. And then this book is fiction, right? So it's actually fiction set in that time period.
Yeah, it's completely fiction. And some of the characters, the character who comes from Baracoa is, that's more me, coming from the eastern part of the country, which has always also been, where Martí was from, where Fidel is from, like the more romanticized hero, fountainhead of the country.
And let me ask you, when you find yourself in this more liberal area, which certainly the arts, is part of that, how do you communicate the book and some of the issues from the country?
I think there's been a growing understanding now. Like, you can't accept autocracies, you can't accept sort of oppressive governments. So there's a growing understanding of that now. But there's still Bernie Sanders who won't apologize for romanticizing Castro.
Right.
So there's still that aspect of it, and that doesn't make Bernie Sanders an idiot, but it really it pissed me off, and I would never vote for him because of that.
Yeah, no, I understand. I feel the same way. The other books that you have are also about Cuba, right? Leading up to this, is there a progression among them, or how did you make those choices?
The first one's basically about my uncle getting killed, and I made him more of sort of a revolutionary hero. But that was such a powerful memory from my childhood, where my grandmother took me and said, "This is where they shot him," and she poked me in the belly. They shot him here, they shot him there. Wow. And my mother took his wife, her sister-in-law, to see the body. They had the body in the hospital, and they were just going to let him die. And there were these two Revolutionary Guards sitting at the door, and they were like, "No puede pasar, señora." And she took this is the story she tells. She took the gun, she put it aside, and she walked in. She goes, "No me parecen tan hombre para tirar."
Wow. Oye, she's a strong woman.
Yeah. So like all the stories went into that first book, and then the second book was about an older lady dying of cancer in Miami, and her memories of Florida, and had a lot to do with the Elian case, which was such a huge deal.
I'm curious about that as well. How did you see the Elian case?
I mean, I First of all, I think the Elian case changed the history of this country. The Elian case won Florida for Bush, and after Bush won, the whole history of this country changed.
Agree.
And to some degree, I saw the Elian case. I was just thinking about becoming a father there, going, if a father wants his kid, you can't do anything about that.
Yeah.
But there was so much lack of cultural understanding. Like I remember when the grandmothers came to visit, and someone said that they checked him under his underwear. He goes, "Oh yeah, hombre," and the grandmothers were abusing him. Oh, come on.
Yeah. By the way, that stuck in my mind as well. I often make reference to that. The issue, though, for me was always that they never really told the truth about the father's attempts to come into this country.
Right.
They hid the fact that he had applied several times.
And that the father was under pressure. So I understood that, but I couldn't cross the line of separate a father from his son. I couldn't cross that line.
And for me, it was also not okay because normally that case would be a family court case decided by a family court judge, and they usually rule in the best interest of the child. But instead, it became an international incident that was solved by the Secretary of State. Yeah. So it was a very, very unusual.
And you had the freaking FBI sort of, bursting into a home and scaring the poor kid to death, and that lost Al Gore lost by 1,000 votes, so that lost the election in Florida.
That lost the election, and then occasionally people will blame the mayor here or whatever, and I'm like, what do you mean? What could anybody have done after Elian? There was nothing to do.
You have to read. If you haven't read this book called Cuba and American History, which won the Pulitzer Prize last year,
I have not.
Fascinating the way that this little island has sort of dictated a lot of what happens in American politics, and it connects both. It's fascinating. You got it by Ada Ferrer. She's a professor at New York University.
I will make absolute positively sure to find that book.
And the title is great: Cuba and American History.
That sounds fantastic. So that one kind of led you to Sacrificio, to coming up. And what kind of research? I mean, it intrigues me that since you didn't live there for most of your life, how did you
I have maps of Havana. I had the books of Havana. I talked to people who lived there in the 90s. I kept on saying, I'm going to get so much shit because I've never lived in this country. In this city. But I've always been, it's the most romantic city in the world, probably. So in some ways I've always been fascinated by it and did history of Havana back to the 1500s. And I've never been, I haven't been back in a while, so I don't really know it. So, but just his research basically, and talking to people who lived there during that period.
And so you also, did you interview and did you keep like digital stuff of these people? Because I always wonder, these folks are starting to get up there in age and we're going to lose those stories. Did you keep some of that, or?
I talked to a lot of the freakies, but I talked to most of the people who lived there during that period to capture that period, and who are here now, who are here in New York or, in Miami or in New Jersey. But I don't think I talked to any of the freakies, and a lot of them are still in Cuba.
So obviously a lot of them survived despite the fact that because these were folks that injected themselves so that they could be with their friends or as a protest, right?
I think both. So and I think a lot of people, Cubans, they're married and they have sex with men and they say, no soy maricón. A lot of people.
They're fluid.
Yeah.
They're fluid sexually.
But a lot of people got HIV and probably through sex and then said they injected themselves. Who knows? Who knows in that kind of sort of oppressive environment, what can be the truth? And that's part of what the novel's about, I think, when you're so oppressed, the truth and lies sort of become intermeshed in a way that it creates its own narrative.
Yeah. I can tell you, I'm gay, and living in Miami during that time period for me, I would think about, because of course, Miami and Havana, there's really no separation. You're talking to people all the time, right? And I would talk to my friends who would tell me how they were forcibly tested and how their friend was removed. And I was horrified because I wasn't anywhere, near testing. I would also talk to my friends that would come over and they would say, once that they actually had treatments, they would say, yeah, I got this treatment and then the pills ran out. And then I started taking some other pills. And the theory was that because the regimen wasn't consistent in treating HIV, the strains in Cuba got a lot stronger, and they became like immune in a way to the treatments that we were using, resilient.
Yeah, and partly because it was so focused in the sanitariums, like that the virus had a chance to sort of coordinate probably and become stronger and mutate.
I mean, the idea of dying there alone is not a great thing.
There's a scene in the book where there's an old man whose mother like worked from the ministry, and he has all these sort of treasures, but he's dying there alone, basically. Yeah.
Do you want to kind of walk us through with no spoiler alert, like don't spoil it, but walk us through the plot a little bit of the book so people can get a feel?
So I took a lot of historical material. 1997, remember those bombs in Havana?
Yeah.
In 1997, that were sort of blamed on El Salvador militants, but who knows what the truth is with the Cuban government? Like, you can't know what the truth is. So I figured that's part of like the book begins with these bombings, and Havana goes completely quiet. And this kid Rafa, who came from the Baracoa, sort of is working at a paladar in Havana, and one of the sons of the woman who owns the paladar is his boyfriend, but he's already been sort of taken to a sanitarium, and he soon dies. And then
by the way, sorry to interrupt, but it struck me that he did not know his age. You know,
he was an orphan from Baracoa, yeah. And
he didn't know how old he was really, like.
Yeah, because I think that a lot of people don't know, like the Cubans, a lot of, aside from Havana, it's mostly countryside, so a lot of people don't have sort of like the records and everything. But yeah, he wasn't completely aware of his real age because he was an orphan who had been raised by a stepmother. But he's working in the pilot, but he becomes fascinated with the brother, who's definitely involved in an insurrectionist group and who may be connected to the bombings. And then they follow the visit of the Pope and to the tension builds from there.
Yeah, it's beautifully written. I mean, in reading it, it draws you in very easily. I mean, especially if you touch the subject of Cuba in any way.
But what's interesting, like this idea of insurrection against sort of an oppressive government. And when I was writing, I go, well, I don't know anything about this. I mean, I left when I was 8, but now, now we started to live through it in this world.
Yeah.
Because I remember January 6th, this is what, an insurrection looks like.
Yeah, exactly. And that can happen anywhere. But I wonder, did you keep up with the July 11 movement? Was that an inspiration?
Yeah, I follow a lot of people on Twitter who are involved in it still, and so that they sometimes have access to Twitter and sometimes they don't. And I think that and the protests after the recent apagón were very big. So I think that, I mean, Canel is an idiot. Canel is like a puppet,
It's Castro family running the country,
right? But soon they're gonna. I mean, how old is La China? La China's gonna be like in his 90s, right?
Yeah, but you have his son running Gaisa. You have the other son running diplomacy, and then Mariela using HIV and AIDS. The LGBTQ, trans, all those issues, which I think is just part of her using it, to make Cuba appear very progressive when it really is not progressive.
I do think, though, like I'm part of the Cubans who think that the blockade should be lifted and the island should be flooded with with open information for everyone, and open, and see. I think that would, because for me, it's not a matter of comunista. It's a matter of, like, you've tried something for 62 years. It hasn't worked.
Yeah,
it hasn't worked. The government's still in power for 62 years. Let's try something else.
Yeah, I'll say that I used to believe in the jeans and Coca-Cola, theory, and I was very pro-engagement when Obama made those steps. And in fact, I think his speech in the Cuban Congress was one of the most brilliant things I had ever seen. I thought that did more.
But that's where the Castros was so. I mean, they've outwitted the American government at all steps. Then all we remember is Raúl raising his hand and Obama's hand limp. That's all we remember,
Or Raúl going like that because he couldn't hear.
Or Raúl, and going, "Que preso político?" Come on, man, come on.
But I'll tell you, when we did that engagement, one thing that kind of made me view things differently is that they didn't open up anything. They went the other direction. They started cracking down on artists, and then and then with Trump coming in, things got even worse. So I don't know, because the other truth to that is what has happened for 62 years is a government that has failed. And so
oh, absolutely,
right.
absolutely.
So for me, if engagement doesn't work, then regime change. But something's got to give, because the people are the victims,
and the people, yeah, and it has to be from the people in Cuba now. Like they have to sort of make the decisions. And the question, the reality is, like, what is it? 90% of the people in Cuba now were born after the revolution,
right? And are unhappy, but they're unhappy, and they want regime change.
Of course,
that's the thing. I mean, they're not out there, talking about lifting the embargo in the streets. They're talking about libertad, freedom.
Right.
They want to be able to speak and to see the world and to,
And I think that's like the frustration with the characters in my novel, that they've been doing this so long, they've sort of like, and living through it so long, that they become in some ways nihilistic. Like they start losing hope.
That's a great point. I feel like that is a lot of what's happened. I mean, you can't do anything. You don't have any firearms. You don't have anything. There's no way to organize.
You gotta survive. You gotta sort of find food for today, find food tomorrow. That's part of the oppression.
That's part of the oppression, because they got you thinking about food for today and tomorrow.
Right.
You can't really do much else. Let me ask you, Ernesto. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I have Cuban friends here, and they're still friends, but I go off on them. Cuban friends here go back and forth. Who goes, it's all new the Americans' fault. I go, come on, man. There hasn't been an open, close to anything to an open election there for 60 years. Give me a fucking break.
Yeah, I always wonder, like, what really happened. Like,
but there's a lot of Cubans in New York who go back and forth and like, because they come from a kind of Cuban, the sort of communist aristocracy.
Right. Yeah, that's another thing that people don't realize, that if you're part of that communist aristocracy, you can travel, you have yachts, you have properties, you do whatever you want.
Yeah, it's just like, but it's so cliche in a way. It's just like any sort of dictatorship.
Yeah, no, without a doubt. When you think about Cuba, what would you like to see happen? I mean, what would you?
I think that I do think that if there's an open flooding, that things will break down. I think that if there's an open flooding of the world, the Western world in Cuba, things will break. And part of the interesting thing in that book that I just mentioned is that Cubans want to be their own people, and they don't want to, and I think that's what gave Fidel so much power, that he stood up to the United States, and then he could do whatever he wanted. Like, because he stood up to the United States, like you talk to Latin Americans in Miami, and they admired him for that, because the United States has done so much harm in Latin America. So I think that part of it is like the Cubans being their own people and creating their own democracy and giving their own sort of independence in a way that they probably never had before outside of the United States. But will the United States allow that? Who knows?
I completely agree with you. I think the fact that Fidel and the revolution stood up to the U.S. made them heroes in the Caribbean and in Latin America.
And in Latin America, to this day, even with all the crimes that he committed.
Yeah, even like you just said, even if it's a dictatorship, a regime, military dictatorship, doesn't matter. They did something.
Fidel was just a more intelligent version of Trump.
He is a super intelligent, without a doubt.
What hurts me a little bit is all these Cubanos voting for Trump. I go, how can you be doing that, bro? It's the same character. Like, how can you be doing that?
Because they still see the Cuban threat, and they believe that a regime change can happen with the help of the U.S. So that's what they're pinning it on.
It doesn't hurt my brothers now. My brothers like, they go, come on, guys.
But on the other side of that, though, I always wonder, because Cuba does trade freely with the whole world. We're the sixth importer into Cuba. So we do trade. We do chicken and all kinds of humanitarian aid. So I always wonder about, really, would opening the floodgates really make a difference? Or are we just going to make the abuser stronger?
That's definitely a possibility.
Yeah, I see both sides too. My
point is that something that hasn't worked for 62 years, whether it's that or something else, there has to be a change, and you can't force a change. It has to come from. You have to give power to the people who are the insurgents, who are the dissidents in Cuba, like power to those are the people. I follow them on Twitter, most of them. Those are the people that sort of impress me the most, like who are risking their liberty, who are risking their lives to say this is what's right and this is what I want.
Yeah, like Movimiento San Isidro, that whole movement that started on the island that's still very much alive. But, you know, a frustration of mine is that those voices do not get amplified in this country. You know, the Cuban government is the only legitimate voice. And so whatever the Cuban government puts out, it has that big megaphone of Cuba, and that's what the world hears. But the voices of the dissident movement, they're buried. I mean, it's up to us. It's the diaspora that tries to amplify.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's absolutely true. And I think novels like this, you know, hopefully people will read it and start sort of changing the perspective. All three of my novels, changing the perspective of how they think about the Castro government. Yes, you know, when I argue, I go, yeah, 100% of the people can read, but if you can't vote, it doesn't matter.
Right. And by the way, I don't know, but it has been quoted before that close to 80% before the revolution could read, or 75% could read. So It wasn't the worst country either in literacy, you know, those kinds of issues. But again, it's what information, what facts, you're
getting out there.
You're getting out there. I think it's great that you did this book. I know that I'm going to read this whole thing.
And my father, but even someone like my father, who was a doctor in Cuba and became, you know, the most rabid anti-communist. But when he was young, he said, "Look, I went to the countryside before, and there were kids who had worms coming out of their mouth because they're getting no health care." So, like, you could see like the ideal of the revolution, but then when those ideals become corrupted, you have to sort of stand up to that.
Yeah, my dad was also a doctor in Cuba. Same thing. You know, he supported the revolution, but then once he figured out,
how can you not support those ideals? Those ideals are marvelous, but then, you know, that's what we're doing here. You know, we're supporting those ideals, but when those ideals become corrupted, you have to stand up to them.
See, and that's an important point, because I think a lot of the Miami Cubans hear the ideals about equality, about blah, 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 you know, these ideals that they heard, and Venezuelans and Nicaragua, because it's not just
and it triggers something.
And it triggers the you know, beware. This is, you know, we're getting in a dangerous place.
My new novel is about a Cuban girl in Miami who becomes very successful in business, and her son gets involved in the insurrection of January 6th.
Oh wow, I'm definitely looking forward to that one. That's fascinating because it's tying.
And she becomes, but Nixon's a character, because I didn't know this about Nixon's a character. She becomes friends with Richard Nixon before he dies. Nixon's butler was Cuban. His best friend, Baby Hermoso, was Cuban. And 6 of the 7 guys in Watergate were Cuban. Go, oh, there's a connection here. We got to use this.
That's excellent.
And he was the most, you know, he was the one who fought for anti-communism the most. And when he met Castro, like I did all this research in '59, when Castro came to visit Eisenhower, Nixon met him, and he goes, he is one of the most sort of charismatic leaders that I have ever met, but he knows nothing about running a government.
Boy, that was foretelling of
I mean, Nixon was smart.
He was. But I want to show your book real quick so people can see it, Sacrificio. And you're going to be at the Miami Book Fair on what day?
November 19th, I think at 1:30.
At 1:30. You can always go to the Miami Book Fair website and find the information. It's Ernesto Mestre-Reed. And look for this, Sacrificio, wherever you can. It's a fantastic book. I haven't finished it yet, but I promise I will within the next 7 days. It was that good. I very much appreciate you being with us. Ernesto.
Thank you. Great talking to you.
My pleasure. Thanks for joining us on the Forward Miami show. And I'll thank all the viewers for joining us as well. See you next week.